So to have red wigglers in your bucket is like, great. A word that I didn't have the word for.
Welcome to PHS Garden Mythbusting, where we team up with the experts of the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society to debunk the myths we told ourselves about gardening. I'm Sabrina. I know nothing about gardening, but I'm here today with Cassidy, who does. And today we're talking about composting. Cassidy, I've heard about composting and all of these great benefits, but I live in a small apartment. It sounds like it takes up a lot of space and might even stink up my living area. So is it even remotely possible for me?
You can definitely handle composting. Composting can be super cheap. It will take up the tiniest little amount of space, and it should definitely not be stinky. I have 2 hound dogs at home, and Millie and Ruby have never once sniffed out my worm bin. If you're using vermicomposting or composting with worms, it's a really great way to do it in a small amount of space. The worms will help break down any kitchen scraps that you might be throwing in their little environment. What you're harvesting is actually fully formed compost called worm castings. And some people will even call it black gold because it's this really rich fertilizer that we're going to end up using in the garden.
So Cassidy, where do I start?
You're going to need some kind of bucket or container for your worms to live in, something that has holes for airflow. And then from there, you're going to want to think about creating an environment inside of that container where your worms are really going to thrive. They're going to need some soil or starter compost. They'll need some kind of bedding. So I really love to use gathered leaves from outside. Dried leaves are the best. And you can also use shredded paper. You'll also need your worms, duh. And then once you have everything kind of pieced together, we can start to think about what you're going to feed them.
So can we talk about the worms for a second? Can I just go outside after the rainstorm and grab some from my neighbor's front yard?
Definitely not. There are different types of worms. Earthworms like that, they'll break down your food scraps, but they're not going to do the best job of it. There are these worms called red wigglers. Red wigglers?
Isn't it red wigglers?
It is, yeah.
This just in, a so-called worm expert who gets the R in the word Wrigglers, sending the internet into a tizzy. More at 11.
And they are powerhouses of composting. They can eat up to 5 times their body weight in a day.
Wow.
Yeah, so they're going to do the job for you. And when you order them online, you'll probably have enough for you and a family member and a friend, and you can all start your worm bins together.
I can just order them online?
Exactly. That's how I did it for mine. I bought them as cheap as $20 to $50. So let's start talking about assembling your worm bin and creating an environment where your worms are really going to thrive. You don't want your worms to be too hot and heated up by the sun. They really love a cool, moist environment. I keep mine in my bathroom where there's not a ton of light exposure. Other people will keep theirs in their garage where they know it's cool and ventilated. So the first thing that you're going to want to add to your bucket is some kind of starter compost or potting soil. At minimum, your worms are going to need about 4 or so inches to create their little home. But if you are going to keep your worms outside, maybe start with half of your bucket. From there, you can add in some dried leaves and your shredded newspaper. You want your shredded newspaper to be kind of moist, like a wrung out sponge. So a little bit moist, but not sopping wet or anything.
And what does that do?
Having that newspaper and the dried leaves is really going to create this layer that's going to trap that smell inside. So if you're ever thinking oh my God, my worm bin's so smelly right now, adding in more newspaper is going to be the trick.
Now, what do I feed our wormy friends?
Yeah, so let's break it up into do's and don'ts. Do. Feed your worms many of your kitchen scraps, things like apple cores, banana peels. Definite don'ts: no processed foods, things that are heavily coated in oil, and don't add meat or milk, and definitely not eggs either. You can do dried eggshells, but not egg itself. And then the same goes for really acidic food. They're not fans of oranges, limes, lemons. They're also not fans of really spicy foods, garlic, jalapenos, things like that. It can be a little tricky to figure out How much do I give them at one go? Because that really depends on how many worms you have in your bin. But the smaller and more broken down your food scraps are, the faster the worms will be at breaking them down and turning them into compost. So if you're putting in a banana peel, you can make it smaller by chopping it up with scissors before you throw them in your worm bin. You can also add your kitchen scraps into a blender with a little bit of water. It'll make it condensed into a nice pulp that's super broken down, and the worms will have a field day with that. When you're putting the food scraps into the worm bin, I know your instinct might be to really bury the food in there. If you're burying the food, the worms are in the soil, but they are surface dwellers. So if you add the food scraps to the top, they're right there ready to go. So worm bin maintenance is really a fine balancing act. This is where things can go wrong. You want to really keep an eye on the water and moisture level in there. If things are looking a little too dry, you can mist it with a spray bottle. You can be adding in more damp newspaper to really help that process. But again, misting with a spray bottle is a super simple solution.
How do I know if I've added too much water or water too much?
The first indication is really that it's stinky. And if you find that, you can just add in more shredded newspaper that you haven't misted. Find that balancing point again.
So when do I know that this is ready to harvest?
So you know that your worm bin is ready to harvest when it's full to the brim. You absolutely cannot add anything else into the bucket. It should be ready to harvest within about a month or two, depending on how big your bucket is that you're working with. The harvesting process will usually take a few hours, but you can do this harvesting process without having to stand over your worm bin all day and lose hours of whatever else you wanted to do with your time.
So where can I use the compost once it's harvested and done?
You can use your compost pretty much anywhere. You can add it to window boxes, your flower gardens, and definitely add it to any vegetables that you're growing. It'll definitely supercharge them. If at the end of this, you're still feeling very, very squeamish, like you don't want to really tackle worms and worm bins, totally fine. There are tons of companies that will do the composting for you. All you have to do is collect your food scraps, keep them in your freezer, and they'll collect them for you every week or so. You can compost indoors and in small spaces. With a little ingenuity and creativity, it's relatively inexpensive to start and easy to maintain once you get it going. Vermicomposting is the most common indoor composting process, which uses worms to break down food and produce castings that can be used in the garden to supercharge your plants with tons of added nutrients. To get started, you'll need a bucket with holes for ventilation, dried leaves, shredded newspaper or cardboard, starter compost or topsoil if you don't have that, worms, particularly red Wrigglers, and food scraps. To assemble your worm bin, make bedding with a mix of starter compost and shredded newspaper and or dried leaves. A good ratio is mostly shredded newspaper or leaves and a sprinkle of starter compost. You'll want your bin to be moist but not wet, like the consistency of a wrung-out sponge. Use a spray bottle to moisten each layer, noting that your top layer should be the moistest and get drier towards the bottom of the bin. You'll need enough bedding to fill about a third of your bin. If your bin will be outside, then bedding depth should be closer to about half of the bin, so the worms have somewhere to go if the temperatures get too hot or too cold. Keep it in a cool, shady spot that won't get too much sun exposure. Compostable food scraps include most fruits and veggies. Just avoid anything too acidic. No meat, dairy products, highly processed or oily foods should be used for composting. When you feed your worms, add a few scraps of newspaper to help with moisture and carbon levels. For the first feeding, feed a quarter of the weight of your worm population. After the first feeding, feed the worms about half of their weight. Never feed your worms again until food from the prior feeding is consumed. The amount of time it will take to be broken down and eaten will depend on how fibrous and how big the pieces are. You'll know your compost is ready when the bin is filled to the brim. To harvest your castings, dump out the contents of your compost bin on a flat surface underneath a light source. The goal is to dry out your compost, forcing the worms to come to the center of the pile over the course of a few hours. Once the worms have made their way to the center of the pile, return them to the bin and collect your castings. If composting doesn't work for you, many local composting companies offer options to compost for you. All you need to do is save your food scraps in the freezer. We hold workshops on topics like composting throughout the year, and you can learn more by visiting the link in the description below or by going straight to our website, phsonline.org.
And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel.
See ya!
Bye.